Day 651 of the Trump administration, and 5 days ahead of Election Day, the president said tonight that although two maniacs had disrupted the momentum of the midterm campaigns, one with pipe bombs, the other with an AR-15 in a synagogue, he feels the momentum coming back. More on that in a moment. But first tonight, we begin with the looming existential threat that hangs over this entire administration. That would be the Russia investigation, and specifically this latest reporting from the New York Times that may further connect the dots between the Trump campaign for president and Russia. This is new reporting about veteran Trump advisor Roger Stone, friend of the president for 30 years, and his links to WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign during 2016. One of the co-authors, Michael Schmidt, is standing by to join us. The Times is reporting on a newly revealed email exchange between Stone and campaign head Steve Bannon that, quote, underscores how Mr. Stone presented himself to Trump campaign officials as a conduit of inside information from WikiLeaks, Russia's chosen repository for documents hacked from Democratic computers. Mr. Bannon and two other former senior campaign officials have detailed to prosecutors for special counsel Robert Mueller how Mr. Stone created that impression, according to people familiar with their accounts. One of them told investigators that Mr. Stone not only seemed to predict WikiLeaks' actions, but that he also took credit afterward for the timing of its disclosures that damaged Hillary Clinton's candidacy. According to the Times, after Roger Stone tweeted about predictions of an October surprise from WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, a reporter from Breitbart emailed him, quote, Assange, what's he got? Hope it's good. Stone writes back, it is. I'd tell Bannon, but he doesn't call me back. The Breitbart reporter forwarded the emails to Bannon, then he seemed to brush them off. The very next day, Assange held a press conference promising weekly dumps of documents.
We hope to be publishing every week for the next 10 weeks. We have on schedule, and it's a very hard schedule, all the U.S. election-related documents to come out before November 8th.
After that, Steve Bannon reached out to Roger Stone to ask about it, writing, what was that this morning? Stone responded, a load every week going forward. The New York Times reports, quote, in an interview on Wednesday, Mr. Stone insisted he did nothing more than posture, bluff, hype based on WikiLeaks' Twitter feed and miscellaneous tips. Stone has issued similar denials about alleged ties to WikiLeaks in recent months, while also lashing out at Mueller.
It is not inconceivable now that Mr. Mueller and his team may seek to conjure up some extraneous crime pertaining to my business, or maybe not even pertaining to the 2016 election. I had no advance notice of the content, source, or the exact disclosure time of the WikiLeaks disclosures. It's now abundantly clear that the special counsel seeks to go through every aspect of my personal, business, and political life to try to conjure up some offense to pressure me to testify against the president. I know that there exists nowhere evidence of Russian collusion or WikiLeaks collaboration or any nonsense pertaining to John Podesta's email. But I'm also mindful of any prosecutor's ability to squeeze underlings to get them to compose testimony against a bigger fish.
A number of Stone's associates have been questioned by Mueller's team, and Stone is also firing back at Steve Bannon in an op-ed in today's Daily Caller. He's accusing Bannon of leaking their email exchange to the media. Stone writes, quote, Bannon's animus toward me stems from a column I wrote for the Daily Caller arguing that he had outlived his usefulness in the Trump White House and should be fired. The next day, he was. On that note, let's bring in our leadoff panel for a Thursday night. Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence, who in the past worked for Robert Mueller, among others. Cynthia Oxney, a former federal prosecutor, veteran of the Civil Rights Division at Justice, who has worked with, among others, Robert Mueller. And Jeremy Bash, former Chief of Staff at CIA and Pentagon, former Chief Counsel to the House Intel Committee. We have also asked Michael Schmidt to join us at the very top of the broadcast here, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington correspondent for the New York Times. Michael, for the people out late tonight, just arriving home, haven't had a chance to read and digest this work you contributed to, what do you view as the takeaway concerning the role of Messrs. Stone and Bannon?
What these new emails that we brought forward today show is sort of the central question of Stone in the Mueller investigation. Was Stone someone who was simply trying to boast about contacts with Assange and WikiLeaks to give him extra relevance, to give him better currency in the Trump campaign and around the president? Or was he truly in touch with them? Was he truly a cutout, truly a conduit? And the campaign wasn't really sure. Several people from the campaign, including Bannon, have told Mueller that Bannon represented himself as in touch with Assange and with WikiLeaks. But who really knew what he was doing? The campaign was also not really sure what to make of Stone. They didn't want to alienate him. Stone is someone who, has openly says he's gone out and created political problems for other people. He's someone that the president trusted. And he was someone who, on the outside of the campaign, was doing a lot of work for the president, really trying to undercut Hillary Clinton publicly and leading those efforts in a way that maybe the campaign thought that they couldn't. So what these emails show is sort of that difficult balance that the campaign had with dealing with Stone, giving him attention and trying to figure out what Assange really had as they're, coming a month into the election, and, what Mueller's looking at in the larger sort of sense of the investigation and where Stone fits in.
Michael, you are fond on this broadcast of describing the Mueller effort in terms of buckets, and we are in your debt because it's a good word picture to paint. Where do you, in light of that, view those various buckets in terms of completion based on what you know?
Well, in terms of buckets in the president, it's probably best to look at it with the president. In terms of this falls into the collusion bucket. And what did the president know? Was this information that trickled back to him? Did Stone tell the president about his contacts with WikiLeaks? Did anyone in the campaign who Stone spoke to talk to the president about it? What did the president know? That is even a question that Mueller has for the president. When we learned the various questions that Mueller wants to ask the president, this is part of it. How much of that information actually got back to him? These are collusion questions. The thing about the buckets is that many of the president's problems are in the obstruction bucket, things he has done since he came to office, his interactions with the Justice Department, his treatment of Jim Comey, his treatment of his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. So this is much more in the collusion area where there are fewer questions about the president.
Mike Schmidt, the creator, as far as we know, of the bucket theory of the Mueller investigation and the co-author of today's piece of work by the New York Times. Mike, thanks for staying up with us. We know it's been a long day. Thank you for being on the broadcast again. Let's go to our panel to start off, and that would be Frank. Frank, tell me how it is that Mr. Stone can rightfully contend that he has taken and passed a lie detector test. Tell me how it is that he can contend with such surety that he was never in touch with any Russians on the other side.
Well, a lie detector test is garbage in, garbage out. So the questions have to be the right questions. So if you're paying for your own lie detector test, you can pay for the right questions to be asked, and you have the right answers to those right questions. So if the examiner is asking you, did you ever talk to anyone at WikiLeaks? And the true answer is no, you're okay. You could say no. But he's not asking you the questions that really matter. Like, were you in contact with Russians who were in contact with WikiLeaks? Or maybe you weren't in direct contact with WikiLeaks, but Credico was, or someone else was. So you shape those questions, and then you pronounce to the world that you've passed your own polygraph. That's the way that's done. As
a friend of mine likes to say, Frank, however, there's nothing that'll serious you up in a hurry quite like sitting across from Mueller and or his investigators. What is likely to happen in that room with Roger Stone?
Well, let's understand this. The person that knows more than Roger Stone even realizes is Mueller. Why is that? We're talking about WikiLeaks. We're talking about the Russian intelligence service. The U.S. intelligence community has those entities covered like a blanket. That means that Mueller has the answers to the test. He has both ends of the equation. So Stone needs to make a decision. I'm either going to lie to the FBI and be charged with that, among other charges, or I'm going to realize that they have the answers to the test. They know the other end of the communications. And so when you get to this point in an investigation, Brian, it's coming to the end. They're asking you questions to see if you're going to lie about what they already know to be true.
Well, it sounds like that would serious up most people. Cynthia, with your former Fed-trained eye, what do you see as far as criminality in today's new reporting by Mike and his colleagues?
Well, I don't think we know, because it is one or the other. Either, he calls himself the king of dirty tricks. He has a tattoo of Nixon on his back, which is just as creepy as could be.
I wasn't going to mention that.
I mean, it just, wow. Ooh, it's too even late to talk about it. Anyway, and it could be, it reasonably can be that he was completely bluffing, or it can be that he did know everything, and that when the Access Hollywood tape came down, he used some secret way to communicate with Assange and said, please drop emails. And we just don't know that. Mueller knows that, but we don't. Something else that we know two other things. One, he's a serial liar, because remember, he said originally, I never spoke to any Russians. Well, that turns out not to be true, because there are texts that show he did talk to a Russian who offered to give him dirt on Hillary Clinton for $2 million. And he remembered in the texts what the guy was wearing. He called him the crazy Russian. He said he had a Russian accent. So that was a complete lie. And it was just this week he said there are absolutely no emails which suggest that I ever told anybody in the Trump campaign about Julian Assange and what was going on with WikiLeaks. But in fact, we have this email today. So we know he's a serial liar. That's one thing we know. The other thing we know is that during the campaign, after he left the campaign and during the general election, he had several campaign committees that were going on that Mueller is also investigating. He was making a film at some point about Bill Clinton, which was very negative, and he also had another campaign. And the person who was working in that other campaign, had about $350,000 in it in a C4, has been talking to Mueller. So it may be one of those situations where he bluffed and said he was so important, which got himself investigated by Mueller, and the end result may be that caused Mueller to find out about other things about him, which may be true. And we just don't know that yet, but we will know reasonably soon.
So, Jeremy, we've been talking with Mike and Frank and Cynthia thus far about Mr. Stone. Let me lead you to Mr. Bannon. As we like to say, callbacks are only good in auditions. They're not good when it's Mueller, and you've already spent 20 hours, and now Bannon has gone back again. What do you think the risk is in this timeline that we're seeing so far to Mr. Bannon?
Well, I think the big picture, Brian, is that there was a Trump Tower meeting in June. At that meeting, the Russian government sent a delegation, and they informed the high command of the campaign, Manafort, Trump Jr., and Kushner, that in fact that the Russian government would be interceding in the election by the hacked emails, by dumping them into the campaign. They were informed of that in June, and then the conversation was about what policy trades they would get if Trump were elected president. Following that, according to Mueller's indictment of the Russian intelligence officials, the Russian intelligence officers actually moved those hacked emails to WikiLeaks. And now we see that Roger Stone got a heads up about that dumping of those emails, and he informed the campaign manager, Steve Bannon. So now we have the following individuals on the Trump campaign witting of the Russian plot: Bannon, Kushner, Manafort, Donald Trump Jr. To believe that Donald Trump, our current president, didn't know anything about it, you'd have to believe that none of those people mentioned anything about it over a span of several months. Several individuals mentioning nothing to Donald Trump about this. I just find that absolutely hard to believe, and I bet Bob Mueller does as well.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.